This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor.
The Book of Manchester. Chapter 1. And it came to pass that the town of Manchester was settled in the days before the year of our Lord 1799, upon the road that leadeth from Charleston unto Camden, a road of the stagecoach and the traveller. And lo, it was a town of no small measure, appearing in the Atlas of Robert Mills, in the year 1826, as a place of fair size by the standards of the day. And it was a place of much use, a stop for the stagecoach, and a centre of commerce for cotton, for it had access unto the waters of the watery river. Chapter 2. Now when the company came together to build the railroad that should go from Wilmington to Manchester, the town of Sumterville was but a thought in the minds of the builders, a station along the way. For their aim was to enter into the southwestern part of the district, and to reach the town of Manchester, which was then a flourishing village, full of life, and known throughout the land for its famous tavern. This tavern was renowned to all the travellers of the South Atlantic states, and many came there to rest and to refresh themselves. Chapter 3. But verily, many years have passed, and much has changed in the land. For the town of Manchester, once the seat of wealth and prosperity, hath fallen from her high estate. The railroad is torn up, and the great plantations that once surrounded her have been deserted. Of the town itself, naught remaineth but a few old stones of chimney and wall, laid carelessly one upon another, and a stunted cedar here and there to mark the place where it once stood. The families that once called it home have been scattered unto the four corners of the earth, and only the name of Manchester remaineth, a shadow of the thriving village it once was.
Perhaps I should have that deep British voice do all of my podcasts. I was playing around with a bit of AI. I took part of the script from this episode and fed it into ChatGPT with a prompt that it should render it in a style similar to the King James Version of the Bible. Then I took that and fed it into the 11 Labs text-to-voice generator. I kind of like the results, but don't worry, I won't get carried away. Hearing that deep accent reminded me of my few trips to the British Isles. When I was in England with Laura, one of our favorite stops was Stonehenge. It certainly lived up to its mystical reputation. The open Salisbury Plains were breezy and cool compared to the heat of London. I could have stayed there all day, but our tour bus had other ideas. I hated to leave, and I hope to return someday. As with any iconic location, there are imitators. There's Carhenge in Nebraska, Tankhenge near Berlin, and Phonehenge made up of old phone booths in Myrtle Beach, right here in South Carolina. The Georgia Guidestones that once stood near Elberton were said to have been inspired by Stonehenge. Today's ghost town is near a structure my cadre of fellow explorers has dubbed Woodhenge. Now, this isn't an imitation of the British monument, even though this ghost town was named for one of the major cities in England. It's the remains of a railroad trestle and junction that once led to the forgotten town of Manchester in Sumter County. A surprising amount of academic work has been done in the Manchester area. The Poinsett Electronic Warfare Range borders the historic town site, and South Carolina law requires archaeological research in sensitive areas. For this episode, much of the information I found came from these archaeology reports. I'll post a link to those in the show notes if you want to read the whole thing. The Kalwasi Basin, as it has come to be known, is formed by the Congaree, Wateree, and Santee rivers. The Catawba and Wateree tribes hunted the thick cypress forests and swamps along the rivers that bore their names. The Catawba Trail followed the east side of the river, and this important trail later became a colonial road known as the King's Highway. In 1740, the area was opened to English settlement after negotiations with Wateree and Catawba. In truth, European diseases like smallpox had already wiped out many of the indigenous people of the Kalwasi Basin. My guess is that the area already had settlers encroaching on the area, but it certainly didn't take long for others to arrive. The earliest recorded settlers were members of the Singleton family. According to a 1983 study, Matthew Singleton is the earliest referenced settler in the immediate vicinity of the Poinsett Range. His petition, dated April 30th, 1753, was for 300 acres of land on or near Shanks Creek. He constructed a 2-story house in the vicinity of the present grounds of Poinsett State Park, about 2 miles west on the west edge of the Poinsett Range. Christopher Singleton, his son, and Benjamin Singleton soon followed. Benjamin received a land grant for 300 acres just northeast of the town site and sold his land to Richard Richardson. The town of Manchester started as a trading post along the Catawba Trail. After Matthew Singleton's death, his family began selling lots to develop a village around the trading post. The first recorded sale of one of these lots was dated December 4th, 1802, by Isham Moore to William Thurtle. The settlers buying these lots in the new town were, quote, wealthy planters who owned large estates near the river and wished a suitable location for their summer homes, close quote, according to a 1975 study. Edwin Scott's father kept a tavern in Manchester from 1806 to 1811. Scott wrote a memoir entitled Random Recollections of a Long Life, in which he says that the inhabitants of Manchester were wealthy planters who owned plantations along the Wateree River and built homes in the town to escape the unhealthy conditions of the swamps and to provide an easy means for social discourse. Besides the homes of planters and the tavern of Scott's father, Scott also states that, quote, the town had a shoe shop, a tailor shop, a schoolhouse, and a number of stores, one of which was owned by Mr. Duke Goodman, close quote. Like many of the Willtown store owners in the last episode, Duke Goodman was most likely an absentee landlord who didn't live in Manchester, but operated his store as a branch location. His operations included a store on King Street in Charleston that sold agricultural goods and hardware, and the import of cotton and indigo from the interior. I found several ads in the Charleston Daily Courier for his goods.
60 dozen prime Carolina hose, just received, and will be sold low. If applied for immediately to Duke Goodman, Bailey's Wharf.
For sale,
Or number 4,
a new canal
Brownlow's
boat,
Row.
built of the best materials, will answer well for carrying wood or rice, as she is 19 inches deeper in the hull than most canal boats. Apply
Prime
to
green
Duke
coffee
Goodman,
in tierces,
Bailey's Wharf.
barrels and bags for sale by Duke Goodman, Edmonston's Wharf.
6 barrels Carolina Indigo. Apply to Duke Goodman, Edmonston's Wharf.
Manchester appears as a reasonably sized town on Robert Mill's 1826 atlas, at least by contemporary standards. It served as a stagecoach stop, as well as a shipping center for cotton, with its creek access to the watery river. Mill's map for the Summer District also shows a spot just southeast of town labeled as R. Singleton's Race Turf. The town apparently served as a place for some of these rich plantation owners and their workers to let off a little steam. It became known as a rough place. A historical marker for the town says that it became known for its, quote, taverns, horse racing, games of ball alley, which I imagine is a type of bowling, and cockfighting, close quote. According to a 1901 reminiscence of the old town in Sumter's Watchman and Southern newspaper,
Manchester was then a resort for the rich men who lived north and south of the town. It was a place where games of all kinds were indulged in on every Saturday. Horse racing, card playing, cockfights, etc. It was a common saying. If a stranger came into Manchester, he either had to fight or run.
the biggest change came with the railroad. The Wilmington and Manchester Railroad was chartered in 1846. The initial plan was to ship cotton and naval stores from the interior of South Carolina to the port of Wilmington in an attempt to compete with the port of Charleston. An 1851 map of the southeastern states shows a more ambitious plan to make the railroad part of a larger route connecting Philadelphia to New Orleans. Despite the plans to compete with Charleston, the railroad was tied into the South Carolina line at a junction just east of Manchester. Sumter Junction, as it was known, connected Manchester to both Charleston and Augusta. The railroad company sold bonds to finance the project, and Ramsey's Depot was built just south of Manchester to handle the trains. One advertisement from 1852 in the Sumter Banner describes a house of entertainment at the new depot.
The subscribers have opened a house of entertainment at Ramsey's Depot on the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad under the care and management of Mr. William Clark, formerly of Sumterville, where every effort will be made to contribute to the comfort of the traveling public. Good stables and careful hostlers are prepared for those who may wish to leave their horses.
Much of the work on the Wilmington and Manchester was done by slave labor. Abolitionist James Redpath wrote about the living conditions for these workers in 1854.
The railroad hands sleep in miserable shanties along the line. Their bed is an inclined pine board. Nothing better, softer, or warmer, as I can testify from my personal experience. Their covering is a blanket. The fireplaces in these cabins are often so clumsily constructed that all the heat ascends the chimney, instead of diffusing itself throughout the miserable hut and warming its still more miserable tenants. In such cases, the temperature of the cabin at this season of the year, November, is bitterly cold and uncomfortable. I frequently awoke at all hours, shivering with cold, and found shivering slaves huddled up near the fire.
Then came the Civil War. Sumter County was spared much of the fighting during the war, but in 1865, General Sherman dispatched about 2,500 Federal troops to, quote, locate locomotives and rolling stock that the Confederates were hiding in the state's hinterland, close quote, according to Wikipedia. General Edward Potter located 9 locomotives and approximately 200 cars near Manchester and destroyed them. In 1866, the railroad was reorganized. By 1872, the tracks had been rebuilt. This time, several miles north of Manchester, through the community of Wedgefield. The town began to die out as merchants moved north to the new depot, or to the growing city of Sumter nearby. A Bradstreet report from 1875 listed only 2 stores in the town. The 1890 Watchman and Southern had this to say about the town.
Manchester, the seat of wealth and prosperity, has fallen from her old estate. Her railroad torn up, the surrounding plantations deserted. There are none left but a few old chimney stones piled carelessly one upon the other, and an ancient stunted cedar here and there to mark its site. Its old families have been scattered all over the States, and the name is all that remains of the once thriving village.
Another Watchman and Southern article from 1901 said that
59 years ago, there were 7 stores in Old Manchester. Now there is 1 habitation. At that time, there was a Methodist church there, where both white and colored met every 2 weeks to hear old Father Owens preach. Now all these have disappeared, also most of the men who lived at that time, and hundreds of bales of cotton are made where scarcely any was made at that time. A great many of the big plantations were deserted on account of the prevalence of malaria.
And so, by the turn of the 20th century, Manchester was all but forgotten. If you drive down State Road 261, the old King's Highway, you won't see anything remaining in the old town of Manchester. There's a historical marker to commemorate the town, with a few scattered rural houses and mobile homes surrounding it. The town's name lives on, though. Manchester State Forest covers a large portion of Sumter County along the banks of the Wateree. There are other nearby historical markers for the plantations that once surrounded Manchester. Milford Plantation, built in 1839 by John and Susan Manning, has been preserved and is now open for tours. The Wateree passage of the Palmetto Trail follows part of the old Wilmington and Manchester line. This rails to trails portion starts in the Manchester State Forest and eventually crosses the Wateree River into Calhoun County. I've had the privilege to hike and to bike this trail. A couple of miles from the trailhead in Sumter County, you come across the old Sumter Junction. Nothing remains of the rails, but there are tall timbers rising from the surrounding swamp. These made up the trestles and bridges that once crossed this floodplain and supported the rails of the Wilmington and Manchester. When we came upon them, it felt like we were discovering Stonehenge, so we called it Woodhenge. I've since heard others refer to this site as such. The timbers cover a wide area, and in dry weather you can hike down to them from the main trail. It's well worth a visit. That does it for this episode of Carolina Ghost Towns. I used lots of resources in this episode, and I'll link to those in the show notes. I'll even include some of the photos that we took of the old Sumter Junction. It's quite impressive. One final comment about the research for this episode, as well as those of the 2 previous episodes. These towns reached their peak in colonial and antebellum days, and all 3 thrived on a plantation economy that relied on slave labor. I read through many contemporary news articles, as well as the wills for many of the key individuals in these towns. There were advertisements for the sale of slaves, reports of runaway slaves, and in the wills, human beings were left to others like any other possession. It really got to me this time. It was disheartening to see human beings treated like livestock, to be bought, sold, captured, or passed along to the next generation. When looking at the history of these towns, I think that it's important to remember that part of that history was quite brutal, both to the native inhabitants and to the slaves that built much of that society for their white overseers. Anyway, please subscribe and recommend the show to your friends. I'd love to hear from you as well. Leave a comment and tell me what you like about the show or what could be improved. I'm also always looking for new places to explore, so if you have ideas for other ghost towns, let me know about that too. And as always, thanks for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.